So tonight we're going to continue our discussion of the EU referendum debate. Well, actually, the way our speaker has presented his title, because we agreed it some time ago, it doesn't actually refer to that referendum, but it may well, I'm sure, creep into the conversation. We are going to have a different format tonight. He assures me that as a journalist, he doesn't do long 45-minute lectures like academics. So what he has to say may well be sort of condensed into a shorter period of time, in which case what we'll do is we'll have a short question and answer session until 8:15, have our usual break, and then come back for more Q&A. So the microphones are at the ready, and the forms in which you can submit written questions will be available in the first half as well as the second. Well, does our speaker need any introduction? I mean, you may not read the Mail on Sunday, where he is a journalist, and of course he's a well-known author too. I think we said on the slides that he's a polemicist, and I'm not quite sure what a polemicist is. I think he agrees. I think it means someone who likes a good argument, but he's always on Question Time, which means he's good box office. I don't know if it means he's in danger of becoming a national treasure. I suspect that's an idea that would appall him. But at any rate, while we may not always agree with what he says, he always challenges us when we're guilty of woolly thinking or when we slip into conventional wisdom that may not at the time be appropriate. You'll have seen all the books that he's written. The most recent one, The Abolition of Liberty, that came out this year, there was a sort of recommendation I noticed when I looked it up, and someone endorsed this book, saying, "It's fair to say that Peter Hitchens remains one of the most misrepresented figures in the British media. Hitchens is, in reality, one of the most thought-provoking and intelligent commentators on life in contemporary Britain." I did check, and it wasn't his mother who wrote that. It seems to have been another journalist. It was another journalist, Neil Clark, who writes in The Spectator and The Guardian, and is regarded as sort of a left-wing and anti-war writer. So he's not, you would say, necessarily in the same camp as Peter Hitchens. So we can take that as a true admiration. But now you have the chance to form your own view on what Neil Clark said. So please let's hear from Peter Hitchens.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I hope you won't regret any of it later on. The delay, by the way, I've been privatized, was sponsored by Network Rail and Virgin Trains. And looking out over you are a particularly terrifying audience. I see so much grey hair that I know you've all been properly educated, so I won't be able to slip anything behind you. The other thing I want to mention is you will all, of course, know that today is International Toilet Day. It really is. And I was a bit worried when I discovered this that I'd been deliberately invited on such a date as a sort of slight, but I'm assured it isn't so. I will try and work some mention of the international concern about toilets into my speech at some point, but I'm not quite sure how yet. To begin, the title of this talk is that the European Union is a continuation of Germany by other means. Something which seems to me to be so obvious that it barely needs saying, but on the other hand, which many people find shocking. And the reason why I think a lot of people in Britain find it shocking is because, in my belief, our attitude towards both of the great European wars of the 20th century is wholly and utterly wrong, out of focus, and skewed. We see it through the prism of the Somme, of the Versailles Treaty, of El Alamein, of D-Day, of the Battle of Britain. In fact, the real conflict was being fought all the time, far away. And the real axis of war in Europe has been, for all that period, and continues to be now, Stalingrad, Ukraine, Brest-Litovsk, Kiev, and Sevastopol. And extraordinarily, when that conflict broke out again, very recently, we found ourselves standing on the edge of it, and in my view, taking very vigorously, at least in terms of the government and the media, an utterly wrong side, and a side we wouldn't have taken if we understood what was going on. Think about it this way. In 1914, we entered a war, in my view, extremely foolishly, as an ally of the Russian autocracy, the Tsarist regime, a far, far more reprehensible and horrible regime, in fact, than the one which exists there now in many, many ways, and also a vast land empire stretching over huge areas of Europe, which it's since lost. In 1941, we were forced into alliance with a Russian murderous dictatorship under Joseph Stalin, without whose aid we would not have survived. These are two essential facts of life which we seldom stare in the face. What was it that brought this about? Why were we allied with such a country in those two circumstances? What really was it that brought us into that war? What was that war truly about? In fact, although terrible things happened on the Somme and at Ypres and at Passchendaele, and the poems of Wilfred Owen remain a beautiful and moving account of the horrors of that war, and although we rightly continue to celebrate our standing alone in 1940 and the Battle of Britain and El Alamein and D-Day and the rest of it as great acts of courage, resolution, and national effort, they were not the central part of the war. The central part of the war was a German ambition to move eastwards, particularly into the area of Ukraine. And that ambition was pursued right up to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1917, which very, very few British people are fully aware of, and which foreshadowed in so many ways things which were to happen later, and which created, for the first time in modern history, a country called Ukraine. That treaty was the almost Carthaginian peace which Germany forced upon Russia after the collapse of Russia. And the collapse of Russia was obtained by Germany in a most astonishing fashion, and people again don't fully realize this. They've heard of the sealed train, and they've heard of Lenin, but they don't really understand just how very much German secret agents, under the instructions of General Ludendorff, paid Lenin and the Bolsheviks very large sums in gold in a classic foreign organized putsch in a major country to overthrow what had by then become, for the first time in history, the Russian democracy. To overthrow the Russian democracy, drive Russia out of the war, and thereby impose this Carthaginian peace on Russia and effectively bring the war to an end, if only they could knock us out in the West, which they very, very nearly did soon afterwards. This was the center of the war. And it was only because they failed, and again, through the immense resolution and courage largely of British soldiers during the Great Spring Offensive of 1918, it was only because they failed very narrowly to do that the map of Europe was not then, once and for all, drawn in favor of Germany. Germany was, by 1914, an immensely powerful industrial, military, naval, diplomatic force, one which nobody in Europe could really withstand alone or probably even together under normal circumstances. It very, very nearly succeeded in 1917, after Brest-Litovsk, in imposing its will on Europe, in doing what it had really wanted to do all along, which was to destroy the Russian Empire and to take a large part of its territory, so large that it could never again recover. This was all repeated in quite considerable detail between 1940 and 1943. And again, by enormous good fortune, really, for the world, the German effort to destroy Russia and the German effort to dominate Europe forever failed. And it failed largely at Stalingrad. And the debt which we owe, whatever we think of Stalin, the debt which we owe to the Russian people for the battle which they put up at Stalingrad remains unpayable. They were the ones who made sure that Germany under Hitler did not, in the end, dominate Europe. That was the war. But do you think that once it was over, the enormous economic, political, social, and theoretical forces which had engendered it went away? Because I don't believe in any way that they did. You can still read, it's still obtainable under a very obscure imprint, a fascinating book called Mitteleuropa, which was written in the middle of the First World War, speculating on the possibility of the entire German peoples, Germany and Austria-Hungary, uniting together and forming a vast land empire in the center of Europe. It was a German dream, which obviously, after the Second World War, was no longer attainable by the means of military conquest. But was it attainable by some other means? Interestingly, we need to go back before Hitler. This is not something which we attribute to Hitler, to a real understanding of what was going on in this. And I recommend all of you to read what I regard as the best history book published in the past 10 years on this whole era, The Deluge by Adam Tooze, which describes in some detail the process. What Germany discovered during its conquest of the former Russian Empire in 1917 was that it could create nations which were not nations. Richard von Kuhlmann, then the German Foreign Secretary, an English speaker, a clever and witty man, devised the concept of limited sovereignty, which he first of all tried out in the creation of a fake kingdom of Poland to try and detach Poland from Russian domination, and which he then proceeded to continue in setting up the puppet state of Ukraine, which was only destroyed as a result of Germany's defeat in the West in 1918, and which would otherwise probably still exist. These foreshadow, in an extraordinary fashion, the remarkable events which began in February 2014 in Kiev, which still seem to me, and there is a link, by the way, to the subject which Bill first mentioned at the beginning of this meeting. There is a link to that in this. This was revived in the extraordinary events of February 2014 in Kiev. Now, these events are often misrepresented and misunderstood in the West. I was astonished, being familiar with that part of the world. I was utterly astonished by the way in which my journalistic colleagues covered it and the way in which many politicians actually addressed it. I thought it was completely and utterly mistaken, and I'm someone who has, on several occasions, been to that part of the world, knows it reasonably well, and lived for 2.5 years in Moscow, partly when it was the Soviet Union, partly when the Soviet Union was collapsing. And I cannot believe the nonsense which was taught. What took place in February 2014 in Kiev was a naked putsch. It was a putsch which took place under considerable foreign pressure and with considerable foreign support. What was happening was this. Ukraine, as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I'm here going to give you some figures, Ukraine, as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, had once again become the most significant piece of real estate in the whole of Europe. After the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and of the Soviet Union, Moscow lost control, direct control, over roughly 180 million people and roughly 700,000 square miles of European territory. I'm not even counting in this its loss of control over areas such as Kazakhstan in the east. It's a separate issue. The European Union, and what I regard as the European Union's military wing, that is NATO, in the same period gained direct control over more than 120 million of those people and 400,000 of those square miles. The reason for the difference between the figures, the reason why the European Union and NATO had not gained as much as the Soviet Union or Moscow had lost, is fundamentally Ukraine, the biggest single territory remaining neutral and non-aligned in the whole of Europe. There was this huge struggle, a diplomatic struggle lasting several years over the future of Ukraine, in which the European Union offered very large financial blandishments to Ukraine to end its non-alignment and to enter the European Union NATO camp. As I say, there were very large sums of money involved because the agreement, the association agreement which was proposed, was not simply an economic agreement. As European Union agreements very seldom are solely economic, it contained very considerable political and military clauses, and would have, had it been agreed, which it eventually was, but would have, had it been agreed, have moved Ukraine firmly into the Western rather than the neutral camp. Russia responded, first of all, by making plain that it strongly disapproves of this, and secondly, by offering its own, actually much more generous package of financial help to Ukraine to try and stave this off. When the then president of Ukraine havered over this and eventually decided that he would go with the Russian package, he was overthrown by a mob putsch in which quite a large number of Ukrainian policemen were shot dead. There's no question of the violence, in which he was ultimately chased from office by a large and uncontrollable mob. The Constitution of Ukraine was not followed in his removal or impeachment. The necessary votes in the Ukrainian parliament were not available, and they were not taken. The thing was entirely unconstitutional and lawless. It was, in all essential terms, a putsch. The mob which obtained that putsch had been egged on by foreign politicians, from Senator John McCain to a former German Foreign Minister Guido Westerwelle and the famous Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State from Washington, all of whom plunged into the crowds which were intent on overthrowing the Yanukovych government. This extraordinary intervention, one which imagined if during the Scottish referendum, German or French or indeed Russian politicians had turned up in Edinburgh and Glasgow urging the Scottish people to vote to leave the United Kingdom. Imagine the outrage that you would feel about this and the extraordinary feeling of injustice and wrong. But this kind of thing was deemed to be entirely acceptable. We're told, and quite correctly, that Russia has sent into the area its own secret policemen, spies, military intelligence, and there's no doubt whatever that Russia has done this and has intervened in many ways. But how many of you know that very shortly after these events, John Brennan, the head of the CIA, was in person present in Kiev? If you do know, you'll be lucky, because most of the Western media didn't cover it, but it is a fact. And one of the reasons it wasn't covered very much is because the head of the CIA very seldom travels abroad, and when he does, he doesn't let it be known where he is, and it was an immensely strong sign of how deep the Western involvement was in that overthrow. Subsequent events, the war which has since broken out in the east of Ukraine, were, it seems to me, entirely inevitable. The separate issue of the Crimea is very interesting because it's often portrayed simply as a wholly unfair and wrongful seizure of territory by Russia, which in terms of pure international law is the case. But you might like to know, because you'll never have read it anywhere except in my column and on my blog, that in 1992 the people of Crimea sought to have a referendum in which they wished to separate from Ukraine. And if they had done so, they would have returned to Russia, because they are, by and large, Russians. It is a majority Russian territory, and they regard themselves as Russians. And they were threatened with violence by the government of Ukraine and prevented from holding that referendum. So it goes both ways. And if you think that it's so tremendously immoral that, to take over territory under those circumstances, that's the country which does it should be an international pariah, then cast your mind back, as most of you will be able to do, to 1974, and the seizure of northern Cyprus by Turkey. Turkey is still there, Turkish troops are still present. The reason for their behavior was actually quite similar to Russia's behavior in Crimea. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is still in the Committee of Nations. There is no boycott of Turkey, there are no sanctions against Turkey, there is no action taken against Turkey whatsoever, but there is fundamentally no difference between the two actions. So if you really think that this is the action of a pariah state which needs to be driven from the international community, then you have some further thinking to do. I make these points because none of them were being made by the supposedly serious media of this country during this period. I also would point out that George Friedman, the very experienced and renowned analyst of intelligence matters in the United States and head of Stratfor, the intelligence analysts, gave an interview to the Russian newspaper Kommersant in which he said, yes, indeed, this was quite clearly a blatant coup, and anybody who says it wasn't is misrepresenting events. I will spare you the details of the vast sums of money spent by the European Union on civil society organizations in Ukraine, which is another way of saying on propaganda and buying influence on Ukraine in the years before this happened. This is a huge struggle. Whether you approve it or not, whether you think that it is something which we should do or not, it is an enormous battle fought by and large by money and intrigue rather than by force, but a huge battle for a vital territory, which, as Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in his 1997 book, The Global Chessboard, I think it's called, I know I got that slightly wrong. Ukraine is so important that if Russia is deprived of control over it, Russia ceases to be a major power. But if Russia controls it, Russia is a major power. It is an enormously important piece on the global chessboard, and everybody who knows anything about strategy understands that. Now, why was the European Union doing this? What is the European Union's relationship to German imperial policy of 1917, or come to that in 1942? Well, I think it's perfectly obvious. I think that the European Union was, when it was set up, a recognition a very reasonable recognition of the fact that Germany was bound to be, by its size, by its shape, by its population, by its immense economic power, it was bound to dominate Europe, whatever happened. Somehow or other, its conflict, particularly with France, had to be institutionalized into something peaceful. Some of you may have read a wonderful book by Arthur Koestler. He's out of fashion now because of, for various reasons, but it's a fascinating book set just before the Second World War called The Scum of the Earth, describing his escape from the Nazis, amongst other things, in 1940. But it begins with an essay on the problem of France and Germany, how these two countries striving for dominance of Europe, the country of bread and wine and the country of iron and steel, are trying constantly to fight for dominance. And of course, France in 1940 lost that dominance forever. But Germany was prepared, in the formation of the European Union, to make an arrangement with France. France would have nuclear weapons. France would have a seat on the United Nations Security Council. France would have la loi. France would continue to have the francophonie, the French Commonwealth. France would continue to be able to act in all respects, much as we do, as if it were a world power when it really wasn't. Germany would have no army to speak of. Germany would have no military power. It would offer no attempt to dominate its neighbors by open diplomacy, but it would have the real power, and it would control the European Union. An arrangement finalized in the little-known Élysée Treaty, which I think was signed in 1962 in the Élysée Palace between the two countries, which is the center of the whole European Union arrangement. And behind all this stands the United States. The United States, which since the days of Woodrow Wilson and Versailles, has been determined to ensure that no power dominates Europe, a job which used to be ours, but which we were no longer capable of doing or competent to do, and was therefore extremely interested between the two wars in trying to control Europe and to prevent dominance, but failed to do so. But after the Second World War was determined it would not fail as it had done in 1939. So, for instance, it is actually the case that and documents exist, right down to bus tickets. They were found in a cache at Georgetown University by a tremendous historical research accident a few years. Documents exist showing that the Central Intelligence Agency actually put together the original European movement and were very, very anxious to ensure that the European Union should be created and that Europe should be one political entity, by and large, under American influence, which is why you find Victoria Nuland and why you find Senator John McCain in the Maidan in Kiev in February 2014, urging on a European Union expansion, which is also, of course, a NATO and an American expansion. This is the nature of power. In the middle of this, where is Britain? On the margins of it, probably not very important. And then there is another part of this which you need to understand. One of the reasons why it happened when it did. One of the reasons why Ukraine is so important is because it is the key not just to the Caucasus and indeed to large parts of Russia, but it is the gateway through which Europe reaches the Middle East. And it was always extremely important from that point of view. When the United States, France, Britain, and some Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, began their efforts to destabilize the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad in 2011, Russia was the principal opponent of that strategy. Now, we could go on for a long time about the nature and reasons for the destabilization of Syria. It's perfectly obvious that the ostensible reason for it, that we don't like undemocratic dictatorships, isn't true, or why would we host in London the appalling dictator of China, followed soon afterwards by the butcher of Cairo, General Field Marshal Sisi of Egypt. We are not in the slightest bit worried about democracy or tyranny, and it simply doesn't wash. But for whatever the reason, an immense diplomatic effort was being made to destabilize Syria, which Russia frustrated by preventing the United States and Britain and France from committing their air forces to the side of the rebels against Bashar al-Assad. There is a sense in which, and again, George Friedman dwells upon this in his fascinating Commerçant interview, there is a sense in which this wasn't exactly American revenge for what Russia did in Syria, but it was certainly an American response for what Russia did in Syria. The United States knew perfectly well that if it moved Ukraine away from Russian influence, indeed away from neutrality towards Western influence, it would hurt Moscow where it really hurt. So we have a very complicated war, both in Europe and in the Middle East, all to do with the creation of a new power, the European Union, fundamentally German, fundamentally designed to contain Germany in peace and prosperity, a reasonable objective. And we have this linked very much with the crisis in the Middle East. And here we have the continuation of the struggle, which in many ways began, not in 1914, but of course in 1870, when the Franco-Prussian War created modern Germany and brought about the Europe with which we now have to live. As long as we fail to recognize this, as long as we fail to understand that that is the nature of Europe, that any continental arrangement of power is going to be and is bound to be dominated by Germany, and any position which we take is going to have to be based on a recognition and understanding of that. As long as we don't understand that, then our diplomacy in Europe, our attitude towards the European Union, is simply going to be vacuous. It's going to be of none effect, it's going to have unintended results, it's not going to have the intended results. And yet, curiously enough, the person who saw this most clearly and earliest of all was Lord Palmerston, supposedly the man revered by so many people as the great Jingo, the man who always stood up for the British Empire, who was always ready to go to war. You may have heard of the Schleswig-Holstein question. You may have heard that Palmerston said of it that there were only 3 people who understood it. One of them went mad, one was dead, and one was him, and he had forgotten. But the crucial thing about the Schleswig-Holstein question was that it was again about German expansion into what is now Denmark, or in fact what was then Denmark and became Germany. And Britain had obligations, strong treaty obligations to intervene on the side of Denmark on this, in this matter. And they were actually stronger by a long way than the treaty obligations which we had to Belgium in 1914, which led us into that disastrous war. And noticing that Germany was an immensely strong and successful land power, and that Britain wasn't, and that we had no way of influencing events, rather than actually fulfill our treaty obligations to Denmark, Lord Palmerston ran away and said he would do nothing about it. And he faced a vote of censure in the House of Commons as a result of doing it, which he escaped, I think, by 2 votes. And I think he was very sensible because he recognized what we didn't recognize in 1914, what we haven't recognized since, what we don't recognize now. Europe has to be dominated by Germany. The United States is anxious in these modern times that Europe is dominated by Germany. The true special relationship in Europe is not between the United States and Britain, which is a fantasy, but between the United States and Germany. And that if we have to make our way in the world, either have to accept that the European Union, if we continue to belong to it, is a German creation and we will be part of a German empire under Richard von Kuhlmann's concept of limited sovereignty. Or we can leave it altogether and say that we wish to be independent. But there are no 2 ways about it. If you're in it, you're governed by it. William Hague's great slogan, "In Europe but not run by Europe," is as vacuous as saying in Wormwood Scrubs but not governed by Wormwood Scrubs. Life isn't like that. This is an immensely important, very significant, very powerful, quite aggressive project which has already caused 2 wars, the first in Yugoslavia and the second in Ukraine, in the course of its aggression. We might want to be part of it, we might not want to be, but before we decide which we wish to be, I think we should work out what it is. And I think it's absolutely true to say, as I began, I shall finish, that the European Union is the extension of Germany by other means.
Right, in the centre, downstairs. So about 6 rows back, Peter.
Yeah,
Gentleman with the beard. And I'll take the next question upstairs. Thank you.
2 very quick questions based on what you've just been saying to us, Peter. First of all, as far as Ukraine is concerned, were the wishes of the people of Western Ukraine to look westwards rather than towards Russia misrepresented? And secondly, in relation to Georgia, which of course doesn't have anything like the significance that the Ukraine does, the actions of Russia in moving in and depriving Georgia of part of their territory, was that justified in the same sort of way?
The Western Ukraine is a very interesting question because, of course, it was actually part of Poland until 1940. And this was one of the reasons for the operations of the Ukrainian nationalists, now a hero in Western Ukraine, but not in other parts of Ukraine, certainly not in Russia, Stepan Bandera. It's very different from the west, from the east of Ukraine in many ways. It's the place where Ukrainian speaking is most concentrated. It is in some ways wholly different, and the nationalism there is very fervent, and it's part of the difficulty of trying to construct Ukraine. And there's a very fine book by Richard Sakwa, S-A-K-W-A, called Frontline Ukraine, which discusses the problems of Ukraine when it became independent and trying to create a structure which would accommodate both the people of Lviv, as they call it, and the people of Donetsk in the Far East, who are much more Russian-oriented. And in fact, Ukraine, by going for a very unitary state and one which was very fierce about being Ukrainian, imposing the Ukrainian language, making people with Russian names change them. If you were called Vladimir, you would suddenly find you were issued with an identity card calling you Volodymyr. It may seem small, but imagine if the government changed your name for you. It irritated a lot of people. This kind of imposed unity and the extraordinary refusal of the Ukraine to use as a major official language the one language which everybody in the country spoke, namely Russian. So it has been a difficult balance. I think the government of Ukraine has managed it extremely badly. And they managed also their treatment of Crimea extremely badly, and threats made by prominent Ukrainian politicians to end the agreement under which Russia could base its fleet in Sevastopol probably helped to precipitate this problem. In Georgia, the report on the war, which was conducted by a neutral party, concluded that Mikhail Saakashvili, the Georgian president, had started it. And I believe that is true, and that most people who understand the situation properly accept that. Saakashvili was hoping to drag the United States into his conflict, but he failed. And as a result, he caused a great deal of bloodshed and difficulty in his own country. It is extremely complicated what goes on in Georgia. I've been to these strange borders between South and North Ossetia and Abkhazia, and it was designed by Stalin, who knew more about Georgia than most of us because he was Georgian, to be very difficult to break away from the Soviet Union. It contains these national minorities who don't want to be run by Georgia and who therefore are happy to be protected by Russia. There are always parallels. It's crude, but it's worth thinking about between these nationalities and, say, the Northern Ireland Protestants. And it is more complicated than it looks. I think Saakashvili was very rash and aggressive and created a war where none was needed. Oddly enough, Sakwa goes into this in his book. Russia's relations with many of its neighbors, from Norway to Armenia, to name a couple, on border questions are extremely cordial, and they don't have many difficulties. The difficulties arise when people try and manipulate their neighbors from outside for other purposes.
Right, we'll take one more question. One more question, that's upstairs on the left. Right, the front row upstairs, Peter.
Your interesting thesis on post-war Germany has wholly overlooked the simple fact that from 1945 to 1991-92, Germany was divided into two, that the Germany that you said helped to create the European Union was not present-day Germany, it was then Western Germany under Konrad Adenauer. And we had for many years the so-called Bonn-Paris axis. I find your thesis in that context, when Europe was threatened by the Soviet Union, when the Red Army was in Eastern Europe in their hundreds of thousands in Eastern Germany, and NATO was set up as a counterweight towards a possible invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union, your thesis to me is wholly untenable. And whatever may be happening these days, historically, sir, you have been unjust, you have been incorrect, and therefore I cannot believe a word otherwise that you say.
Well, right.
I can't.
Another polemicist, I think.
No, I'm not. I couldn't attempt to be encyclopedic on the subject, or I'd have been here all night. I'm very familiar with the division of Germany. I travelled a lot in divided Germany. I'm very familiar with the group of Soviet forces in Germany and its diplomatic effect on Europe, and I'm very familiar with NATO when it was a proper alliance against a genuine threat. The fact remains that I think there is a strong continuity between the federal Germany of Adenauer and the Germany now, not least because when the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact, collapsed, there was no attempt at any kind of merger on equal terms between the Federal Republic and the GDR. The GDR was taken over, totally lock, stock and barrel by Helmut Kohl, in what must have been one of the most economically incompetent episodes in human history, I have to say, but it was done, and that's what it was. It's true that the existence of the Cold War postponed the dominance of the huge dominance of Germany over the European Union, particularly over Eastern Europe, which has since followed. And of course it prevented episodes like that in Ukraine. But the fact remains that the Bonn-Paris axis was still at the heart of it, was still very much under American tutelage, still had the same ultimate purpose. And in the end, we have what we have. I don't think there's any point at which there's no continuity about the European Union. It's just got a lot bigger and a lot more powerful since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, which is why Margaret Thatcher, who understood, and indeed Francois Mitterrand, when the wall collapsed, actually sought quite hard until they realized it was impossible to prevent reunification because they could see that it would lead this way. But it was adding to something which had already happened. So I reject your claim that it's ignorant and untenable. I just think it's a complication, but it doesn't alter the fact that the tendency was in that direction. And as soon as Germany was freed by the collapse of the Soviet Union to regain its former very powerful standing in Eastern Europe, it took it. And I have to say that the activities of Hans-Dietrich Genscher and the Ostpolitik conducted by him and before him by Willy Brandt on the subject were all designed in that direction. Germany yearned to be back in its position in the eastern centre of Europe, and the moment it was over, it was of course German influence which compelled the recognition of Croatia and the resulting horrors in Yugoslavia.
Two written questions for you, Peter. One's from John Lee, harking back to your discussion of the Ukraine. And you may have part answered this, but did the anti-Russian speaker rhetoric of the Kiev leadership and the selection of a cabinet by acclamation, how far was that, if you like, the trigger for the present violence, conflict, troubles? I mean, you said it was external powers, but to what extent was that internal language factor?
I think there'd been internal problems for some time, and the Ukraine is a very divided country. It's in some way less divided now because a large part of eastern Ukraine is semi-detached, and therefore the division is less equal. But it just is politically divided. And actually, the interesting thing is how little advantage Russia took of that during all the long period of independence after 1991. There was, I think, a pretty genuine understanding in Moscow after 1991 that the countries which had left the former Soviet Union were independent and should be left alone. So I don't know. I think that the internal bitternesses within Ukraine would probably have gone on much as they had been for some. I paid a visit to Sevastopol and various parts of eastern Ukraine a little while before this happened, and sort of predicted there was trouble coming, though I had no idea how bad it was going to be. But I thought it would be internal. There were ludicrous things that, for instance, people in Sevastopol who were largely Russian-speaking were told that if they went to the cinema, they'd have to watch films in Ukraine, which is a bit like you having to watch films in Welsh. And these ridiculous things being imposed, which people really didn't like. And it was there that I met people who said that their identity cards had been altered so that their names had been changed. And these resentments were going on. But I think it would just have carried on if there hadn't been the external stimulus, if there hadn't been the attempt to shift Ukraine from a neutral, a non-aligned position to a Western EU-aligned, NATO-aligned. They're not a member of either of those things. It's not capable of being a member of either of those things. It doesn't have the military power or the economic standing to do either, and won't for a long time. But if it hadn't been for the outside intervention of the EU and of the United States, I think they would just have carried on squabbling, perhaps sometimes quite violently, but internally and continuing with a modus vivendi, because things were so tightly balanced. What's happened now is quite possibly that Russia has lost permanently much influence in Ukraine, but Ukraine may well have lost its east at the same time, and neither side has really got what it wanted, except that Russia has definitely got back Ukraine. And the crucial issue of Sevastopol, which was really a matter of total, vital, unshiftable importance for Moscow, has been resolved, because it's quite clear Crimea is going to stay Russian from now on unless somebody makes a war over it.
I'll go upstairs in a minute, but since you've been talking about boundary issues some of the time, let's take John Mottram's question, a bit obscure, but how does Russia still justify retaining Kaliningrad, Königsberg? That's on the Baltic, is it not?
I don't think there's any, for a very long time, this is one of the fascinating points of history that I often raise in the argument about Israel, that there is a movement in Germany which campaigns for justice for those expelled from what are called the Lost Lands. And some of its members dream perhaps about getting back the land that was lost under the Potsdam Agreement and from which they were expelled. But I don't think there's any serious political current in Germany which wants to do so. And I think it would be too, because Kaliningrad is such an important naval base, it's unlikely. And the other thing you have to remember is that in Russia there remains a strong feeling of moral justification for these conquests. That the seizure of Königsberg and its conversion into Kaliningrad was a message to Germany that its behavior was not to be tolerated and was indeed being punished. There were terrible scenes when the Russian army, the Soviet army as it then was, arrived in East Prussia towards the end of the war. Awful pillage and murder took place. There's an account of one occasion where on one of the ruined houses had been scrawled in Russian, "Look at you. You have beautiful houses, wealthy farms, canned food, electricity. Why did you come to our country and ruin it?" There was this total bafflement that these people had come and risked everything to come and destroy Russia. They couldn't understand it. And there was a genuine fury in the Russian response and a huge moral feeling after Stalingrad and Leningrad and the awful scorched earth of the Wehrmacht and the SS in Russian territory, that they were justified in holding that territory. And I have to say that having lived for a couple of years in Moscow and seen the old Red Army veterans dancing the lambada in Gorky Park on Victory Day, I have a certain sympathy with this. They reminded me of quite a lot of British servicemen remembering D-Day, and I didn't really feel there's anything terribly wrong with it myself. They can have it as far as I'm concerned. What I think will eventually happen with all these areas, and this includes the old Sudetenland and the parts of Poland which were formerly German, is that as the European Union consolidates, if it succeeds in doing so, which is by no means guaranteed now, but if it does, that economically Germany will move back into the areas where it used to be. The old Autobahn between Königsberg and Berlin will reopen. German investment in what used to be Königsberg will revive. But for the moment, what used to be Göringstrasse will continue to be Ulica Gagarina, which is what it is.
The next question is going to be from upstairs, Peter, right at the back on the right-hand side.
Thank you, Peter, for this evening's talk. It's broadened my history of Europe and increased the interest even further in how it might develop. But a particular one, perhaps a rather simple question, but may not have a simple answer. Does Angela want us in or out?
Yes. Well, a few people are asking that.
I think they would definitely prefer us to be in. I think the German establishment would prefer us to be in because politically it would be, it's the old J. Edgar Hoover and Lyndon Johnson arrangement, isn't it? Better to have him, how shall I say, inside the tent spitting out than outside. Well, you know what I mean. But on the other hand, and this I got from David Goodhart, who was editor of Prospect magazine, a very lofty pro-European organ, and who'd also been a correspondent in Bonn, that he'd heard senior German politicians in Bonn, which was then the capital, referring to the British as die Affen von der Insel, the apes from the island, contemptuously. There's a sort of exasperation in Germany with our refusal to be part of the project. And ultimately, if we hold it up too much, I don't think they'd be that sorry to see us go. If it really came to it, they could cope. It's not central. We were never central to their project. We imagined that we were. There's all this rubbish about 2 world wars and 1 World Cup. We think we're central to their life. Actually, one of the fascinating things about Hitler is that he never really cared about us. And the Kaiser, when asked about, made a number of rude jokes about British military capability, but one of the ones he made in 1914 when it was pointed out to him that Britain might join in on the side of France and Russia, he said, dreadnoughts have no wheels. Which is a very good point, because indeed they don't. And it took us a very long time to assemble an army big enough to have any influence on the outcome of the 1914 war. They never really saw us as central. They were annoyed that we came in 1914 on the side of France, thereby depriving them, they thought, of a quick victory. And they were baffled by our engagement in 1939, as in some ways, so am I. So I think they would be now, they prefer us in. But if it really came to it, if we really made a big enough nuisance of ourselves, they'd say, who cares? We'll manage without you. Thank you very much.
The next question is downstairs. It's on the front row, far right.
I'm sure you're quite right to highlight the interests of the Germans eastward, which has been going on for a long time. Yet, post-1945, the Americans have put so much cash into Western Germany. Are the Germans not just being used as a sort of proxy for American foreign policy towards the Russians?
Yes, I hoped I'd conveyed some of that. That the whole project is fundamentally a revival of the Wilsonian idea of creating a peaceful, stable Europe which can trade with America, but which has no power on its surface that can challenge America globally. So yes, but that doesn't mean that Germany has no independence of action within that arrangement. And I think it does. Actually, what Friedman says, again, is that what America probably has always feared more than anything else is a German-Russian rapprochement. And this has always been very alarming to Europe, both at Rapallo in the 1920s and, of course, in Moscow in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. When Germany and Russia get together, the world trembles. It doesn't tend to be good news for anybody. Except possibly for them, and not even them in any case. But I think that Germany has a lot of independence of action within the American project for Europe. But I think if Germany started actually being more friendly towards Russia and actually coming to a permanent arrangement with Russia and perhaps encouraging a true association of Russia with the European Union. And here's the thing, so it's a digression, but it's important. There's a very simple question here. Why does the European Union stop at the Russian border? Why does it not? It's very simple. It's obvious as soon as you look at it. Russia is far too big to enter the European Union without ending German dominance and providing a rival to Germany so great that the whole organization would be completely altered. It's not even contemplated. That's why it's not really a European Union. It's something else entirely, and to call it the European Union is false. But no one ever mentions this because it's understood by everybody that Russia couldn't possibly join the European Union in its current state. And if it ever did, it would be so transformed that it would become, apart from anything else, a much more important world power diplomatically and militarily than it is now, and would greatly alarm the United States and probably China as well if it were created, and the Middle East. So I don't think it will happen. But Germany has freedom of action within quite wide bounds. But if it ever upsets America, I think that Germany might find that John McCain is on the streets of Berlin urging people on against the government.
The next question will be upstairs on the right-hand side, halfway back.
Can you all hear me, by the way? I'm not mumbling too much.
My question relates a little bit to the previous question from upstairs. At the moment, Germany's having a huge influx of immigrants, I believe up to 18,000 a day arriving in Munich. How is this going to affect Angela Merkel's position and the position of Germany sort of in the near future?
Well, I haven't...
Can we just combine that with another question? Do you mind?
Well, okay.
Are you in full flight?
Well, I mean, it's only that
Okay.
this is sort of Blairite thing where you end up not answering either question.
Right, go for it then.
That's why Alistair Campbell developed it. I mean, we'll never answer them all. So one by one, I'm very simple.
Go for it.
It helps me concentrate. I don't know. I'm not really an expert on current German politics. I haven't been there for a while. The rumor is that Angela Merkel is on the way out, that she blundered so badly over that her own party will sooner or later stab her in the back or possibly the front over it. Germany, on the other hand, does have this problem it's the only country I've ever been to in the world where the contraceptive machines are so fantastically honest. They say on them, anti-baby. Which is, I think, the view of much of the German middle class. They don't want any babies, and so as a result, they have a very severe labour shortage, which they aim to overcome through immigration. And they've sort of successfully integrated the Turkish guest workers, and they think they can do it again. So, from that point of view, you can see what she was thinking of, but it just got out of control. I've never understood why people think she's so wonderful. I've never thought she was that particularly bright or cunning, and I think this episode demonstrated that she really didn't understand the nature of the vast movement of population which is currently taking place from the Middle East and Africa into Europe, the biggest since the huge influx of Hispanics into America about 10 years ago, an enormous world-changing event, which she thought was just a bit of immigration. I think she misjudged it. I think she'll probably pay for it. I doubt she'll be there in 5 years' time.
Before we take the next question from the floor, can I just I'll take the risk of reading out two. We can do them separately. But they're about sort of German influence on the UK. Okay? So if your analysis is correct, is the German influence benign or malign from a UK perspective? That's from James. And the other one is slightly different, from Damien Hazelwood. Can this domination by Germany be stopped, or should it be stopped? I mean, or is it a reasonable thing to have around, again, from a British perspective? Are you happy with that?
Yeah, sure. No, they combine quite well. It's neither benign nor malign. The thing is that it's dominated by the interests of Germany, quite reasonably. Germany pursues her interests as nations should. I'm all in favour of that. I think that we should do the same. And I believe that I think, again, Palmerston, nations don't have permanent friends, they have eternal interests. They should pursue them and defend them. And I think the French are also very good at this. You just do and the Russians increasingly under Mr. Putin are very good at this. This is in our interests, we will do it. And they do it. And to call it malign or benign is like trying to give a character to a force of nature. Say, is gravity benign or malign? Germany is huge. It will dominate Europe, whatever you do, unless you have some ghastly savage act like the Morgenthau Plan, which would have been a war crime and resulted in starving huge numbers of German people to death. Unless you do something like that, Germany will inevitably dominate Europe. That's what will happen. The question then is if you wish to be within this dominated Europe, or whether, as in fact our history as a serious and important country really began with Henry VIII's break from Rome and England's break from Europe in general. And we've been at our most successful and our most free and our most prosperous during that period, and since it began to end, less so. I get the strong impression, and this is one of the fears when the European Coal and Steel Community was set up, that in the nature of the European Union, its centralization of its industry and economy has meant that countries on the fringe find it harder and harder to maintain, particularly an industrial productive economy. Most of ours has vanished. Around here, you know that better than most. And I think that is, to a great extent, a product of our integration into the European Union, where we're not either expected or required to continue to be a major industrial nation. And we have indeed ceased to be. If we became independent, we might be able to reconstruct that. We certainly, and a parliamentary question has just been asked by Lord Storrett of Swindon, revealing, I think we had, in the most recent year, an £89 billion deficit in trade with the European Union, which can't be a healthy arrangement to have with a supposed partner. So, not malign nor benign, but as long as it's there, and as long as we allow it to make our laws and to make our terms of trade, I think we'll probably suffer because they're not being made in our interest. They're being made in Germany's interest.
We're going to take the next question on the front row, right in front of you, Peter, and then we'll go upstairs.
Peter, remaining with the present day, who should so-called Islamic State fear the most, the West, the Russians, or Anonymous?
Sorry, the Russians or?
The West or Anonymous?
I was very struck by something which David Cameron said in Parliament the other day about Raqqa being the head of the snake. My problem with this is that what seems to me to be the case is that Islamic State, although it's a sort of state which has sort of armed forces and a kind of government which levies taxes, it may itself be a symptom of something else. And what is that something else? And what is the snake? And where is its head? And that something else seems to me to be a particularly stern, intolerant, puritanical form of Islam. And the origins of that stern, puritanical form of Islam are not in Raqqa. They're in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia. And the real difficulty which the Western nations have is that ever since Ibn Saud's meeting with Roosevelt in the Suez Canal, on Roosevelt's way back from Yalta, there has been an extraordinarily tight link. I talked to special relationships earlier. The special relationship of all special relationships, the specialist, most special, totally special relationship in the world is the one between Saudi Arabia and the United States. And we have a pretty special relationship with them too, because we rely on them to buy our weapons and we rely on them for oil, which is why, for instance, when the King of Saudi Arabia recently died, flags were flown at half-mast in London, and why the royal family spends half its time going to and from Riyadh on visits, and why David Cameron recently accepted some award from them, and why we never, ever, ever say anything about repression or intolerance in Saudi Arabia. So I don't know whether we're looking in the right direction here. Is Islamic State a thing in itself, or is it an outcrop of something else? And is that something else something anybody is actually prepared to confront? And if they're not prepared to confront it, then are we at some point actually going to have to make terms with it, the way we made terms with the IRA and the PLO? I don't know. But I think one of the things I'm absolutely certain of is that air power by itself never won any kind of war under any kind of circumstances. And our hesitations over allying with the Syrian National Army under Assad, or with the Syrian Kurds, who frightened the pants off Turkey, NATO Turkey, remember, makes it very difficult for us to form a military alliance which could effectively defeat ISIS in the field, which suggests to me we don't really want to. I may be wrong, but it seems to me that if we were prepared, if it's so desperate that it's the worst thing in the world, if we were prepared to ally with Stalin, that grisly monster, to defeat Hitler in 1941, then we really shouldn't balk at an alliance with Bashar al-Assad, for instance, now. But we do, which suggests to me that we don't really mean it, and that we don't really intend it, and that something else is going on. And I'm not sure what, but I think that Saudi Arabia is really at the heart of it. And I also would say, as I said the other night somewhere else, that British foreign policy is increasingly made in Saudi Arabia.
Let's go back to your your earlier thesis. We've talked a lot about Germany, but we've got a question here about France. So has France just been a willing follower in this EU development that you've outlined, or did they in fact try to dominate it and actually fail?
The history of France is a terrible tragedy, and anybody who loves France, which I do, has to look on it and say that it is immensely sad what happened. But it's a simple matter, as Kirstler describes in Scum of the Earth, the birth rate of the two countries, the population, the industrial capacity, simply were not matched. Germany overbore France on these matters. In the First World War, and one of the things which really annoyed me most of all during the period of September the 11th and France's refusal to take part in the Iraq War were the sneers at France which came from Americans, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and that stupid joke on Google looking up French military victories and finding there were none there. Leave aside the fact that the most important French military victory in history was at Yorktown, without which the Americans wouldn't have a country. Leaving aside that one, and thank you, Admiral Comte de Grasse, particularly, but leaving aside that one, the French resistance to German invasion at Verdun is one of the great historical resistances of human civilization. And just to contemplate what they went through for that is extraordinary. But is it not rather easy to understand, after going through that in the First World War, that they were unwilling to go through it again in 1940? And a lot of French people will say to you, if you press them on this, sometimes it is a choice between Verdun and Vichy. And if you, referring to us, the Rospies, if you didn't have the English Channel, you might understand that better. I don't think France had any real choice. And it's very interesting that the man who probably pursued French integration into the European Union most of all, François Mitterrand, was simultaneously a man of Vichy and a man who also managed at the absolutely right moment to switch his allegiance to the resistance, which again summarizes a lot of what the French elite is really about. Not everybody was de Gaulle. The resistance wasn't as big as it looked, and nor would it have been here if we had been under the same circumstances. They went through terribly difficult circumstances, and they've got what seems to me to be quite a good compromise, which is why they stand by it so firmly. Whether, given the enlargement of the European Union and also the much greater power of Germany and their own economic crisis, it can continue in such a way that it's bearable for them, I don't know. I think there is de Gaulle at one stage, and this is described in a wonderful passage in Hugo Young's book, That Blessed Plot. De Gaulle at one stage sought to sabotage the European Union and get Britain and France out of it. And do you know who prevented him from doing it? The British Foreign Office were so determined to keep the European Union going that they torpedoed de Gaulle's attempts to break it up. So it is an issue for serious French patriots such as de Gaulle, and it always will be. They resent it deep down, but they know they have to do it. But I don't think they really ultimately had very much choice, and it's not for us who have the great fortune of having that wonderful stretch of salt water between us and the continent. It's not for us to lecture them on it or to feel superior to them about it, but it is for us to rejoice at the fact that we do have that stretch of water and we don't have to go that way.
There was just one other aspect of that question. Do you think they failed in an attempt to dominate the EU, or at least to be an equal partner? Because your thesis is that they're no longer an equal partner.
I think they always knew. I think they always knew the deal. They would have the shadow and Germany would have the substance. And remember, while this was going on, they were going through the Les 30 Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, the great economic boom during which their lives immensely improved, and France became the extremely advanced country it is now. And so the economic consequences of the deal, as well as the ability to continue to march across the world stage as a respected major power, made it more bearable. As it's now, when their economy is stalled and it's obvious that their power is diminished, and also they have a huge, insoluble domestic political crisis and trying to cope with the Front National, it's now that it begins to chafe. But up till now, they've actually done rather well out of it. And the other thing, of course, is the common agricultural policy, which is part of the deal. They got a lot of money out of it too, but it's not. I don't think limitless. I think the moment may be coming, and I think the growth of the Front National absolutely follows that, because this is a very, very serious threat to the Fifth Republic as it now stands. That I think the moment may be coming where France, or a large part of France, seriously seeks an exit.
Now, the microphone is upstairs, near the front, right against the wall.
Peter, how long do you think the Schengen Agreement will persist for? How long do you think the EU will persist for? Taking into account that the demographics are changing by the day, and that it's reckoned by some sources that indigenous Swedes will form a minority population in their own country in just 15 years' time, and by other sources 44 million Muslims now live in Europe, and things are changing quite fast. Do you think the EU will still be here in another 50 years' time? If it is, do you think it'll take the form it's taking now or something similar? And by the way, I've read your book, The Abolition of Britain. I think it was too optimistic.
You think it's what?
Optimistic. Okay.
Anybody who's read that will know that it's
Alan
has
asked a very similar question to the one we've just had from Bill.
Well, if I were a clairvoyant, I'd get a job with MI5, which is in serious need of them. So I don't know. I think that there is a possibility, which of course has origins in the French Empire, which was, as you all know, largely in the Muslim parts of Africa, particularly North Africa. There is a possibility that the growth of Islam in Europe will lead to some sort of. Some of you may be familiar with the work by the person who uses the pseudonym Batier, or Daughter of the Nile, Eurabia. The idea that Europe and the Arab world will form a sort of union of what is now roughly the European Union, much of North Africa and Egypt and the former French Empire. It's a possibility that that's the direction we'll take. I think that one thing that history tells us is that all kinds of extraordinary things can happen. I think, as I say, this level of migration, and I've been saying this for a long time, long before most people even noticed it was going on, partly because I was born in Malta and I'm very conscious of what goes on in that island, and noticed some years ago that there was a major problem there, but it's huge. The trans-Mediterranean migration and the migration coming out of the Middle East is enormous, and it's going to change Europe politically, demographically, culturally, and quite possibly religiously in a way which it's hard to see how anyone could control. Whether the European Union will survive in it to be the agency which then merges itself with something larger and the Eurabia project comes true, whether the European Union will fall apart because of its many internal contradictions. And the attitude of many of its leaders does remind one very much of the caricature of Marie Antoinette, who was never that stupid. There is an enormous complacency in the higher council of the European Union, partly because there's no opposition in the European Parliament. There's no really independent press in much of Europe, and a lot of these people are ludicrously complacent. There are many possibilities, and very few of them are good, I'm afraid. If you're going to accuse me of optimism, then I think you'll have to drop that there.
We're now going to take a question. It's on the left-hand side, Peter, 2 rows back.
Right. I've just finished reading Martin Sixsmith's History of Russia. I waded through it. There are a number of things that come out of that. One is that Russia has had influence in the Caucasus and Ukraine over many, many centuries to a greater or lesser degree. And a strong leader is very, very important within Russia, given the strength of Putin. One of the other things that comes out is that some of the problems of Russia, or the historical problems of Russia, have come from the variable supply of food to the Russian people. Given that the Ukraine is has been described as the breadbasket of Russian influence, as it were, and supplies a huge amount of food, as I understand, to the Russian people, is this not good enough reason for Putin to continue to be, to need to have a very, very strong influence in Ukraine?
I'm sure it's part of it. I'm not really sure about the Russian food supply nowadays. Other parts of Russia have developed agriculture which didn't exist in the days when Ukraine was first called the breadbasket of Europe. So I don't know whether it's that vital, though its main importance is strategic. A piece of territory which if you don't hold, you're incredibly weak, and if you do hold, you're stable. There is an important point about Russia, which again, people who are surrounded by large stretches of deep salt water possibly need to understand. I know people sometimes say things about foreign languages which are more than faintly ridiculous, and George W. Bush saying the French had no word for entrepreneur is my lasting favourite. And I don't claim to be a fluent speaker of Russian, but I speak a bit, and I have Russian friends, and I've checked this out, and it's true. The Russian word for security or safety, безопасность, which forms part of the name of the KGB, Комитет государственной безопасности, is a negative word. What безопасность means is without danger, without opasnost, danger, and that's what it means. And there is no positive word for safety in Russian. There is in Moscow, in one of the more beautiful parts of South Moscow, a street called Balashar Odninka, which means the street of the Great Horde, and it's called that because the Golden Horde used to turn up there every 5 years to collect their tribute. And people are told that Asia begins at the Urals. It's not true. Moscow is a frontier city. It's really where Europe ends and Asia begins. It's a place which has never been safe, which has been repeatedly invaded. And that determines the whole nature of its politics. It's why it's one of those places where it's an army with a country rather than a country with an army. And it will always be so as long as it exists, and you're as likely to remove it as you are to be able to remove the Himalayas with a teaspoon. It's there, again, like Germany. And this simple recognition that Russia has concerns and that it doesn't have natural borders such as ours or such as those of the United States. The United States has as its neighbors Mexico and Canada. I mean, imagine if Poland had Mexico on one side and Canada on another, how Polish history would be different from having Germany on one side and Russia on the other. But it's not that way. If you have Mexico and Canada on north and south and the Atlantic and the Pacific on to your east and west, you can be pretty smug. But if you've got Germany on one side and China on the other, then you can't. And Russia can't be. And the simple recognition of this fact would help us all to understand why Russia does get a little bit alarmed when people start maneuvering on its borders. But even the United States, I reckon, if the Russians started moving in, say if Quebec held another referendum and declared independence from Canada, and opened up a military alliance with Russia, how long do you think it would be before the United States became perturbed and took some sort of action to bring that to an end? I should say about 20 minutes. And I don't... shall we just all be a lot less smug about Russia and a lot more willing to understand that it has legitimate concerns about its security and future? It's regrettable. Putin has some admirable qualities as an international diplomat and for standing up for his country, but he is a sinister tyrant. Oleg Magnitsky died in prison under his direct power. There is no doubt that the FSB was caught putting explosives into blocks of flats to set up fake terrorist activities. These are things which are known and can be proven. Leave aside all the rumours and suggestions. And he has suppressed opposition and destroyed opposition media, and it is almost as bad as our NATO ally Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey. But he is actually much worse. But Russia would be able to have a much more stable government and much better leaders if we didn't stop messing around with it. And if you really, really want Russia to be more free and law-governed and democratic, then stop messing around with Russia's borders and threatening it and irritating it and making it feel insecure would be a simple piece of advice I'd offer.
We're going to have time for one more question from upstairs. We haven't had a question from the centre block. Is there anyone who'd like to?
Centrists.
Yeah, the centrists upstairs. Anyone? Because meanwhile we have think about it for half a minute. And we've got a question downstairs on the left of the centre block, 5 rows back.
Good evening, Peter. Thank you very much indeed for an interesting talk. You said to us when you first started that today was the day of the toilet.
World Toilet Day. Yes.
World Toilet Day. You also mentioned you had some knowledge of Russian. You may know that the word in Russian for toilet is unitas. And the unitas was a WC basin designed by Mr. Twyford, who lived, worked, and formed the sanitaryware industry not 5 miles from here. So,
bravo! I'll tell you another. The Russian for railway station is Vokzal, because when the Russians came over to look at the British railways, they were shown the station, then quite impressive, at Vauxhall in London, and they said, "What is this called?" And they were told, "Vauxhall." Ah, Vauxhall. Also, there is a command in the Russian Navy, Rindabe, which means ring the bell. So similar origins. It's not just that, but I heard other words than unitas for the facilities in Russian, I have to say.
We're going to... Yes. Thank you for that most interesting question.
It was interesting.
Well, it wasn't a question, announcement. We're going to end the evening with a question from Richard Wallacott, which I think is inevitable. And take your time over this one, Peter, and just put Germany to one side. Will the United Kingdom be better staying in or leaving the European Union? And you might want to take account of your theory of German hegemony into account.
We would have been better off staying out when the opportunity was offered to us to come in the first place. It was wrong to join. It was a mistake, economically, politically, diplomatically, historically. What worries me is that I'm not sure we have still got the wherewithal as a people and as a country to leave. And I don't think... I've been against this referendum from the beginning. I thought it was a promise made by somebody who had no intention of keeping it and who was astonished when he won the election and found that he did have to do so. Nothing else can explain, it seems to me, that the laughable nature of these demands, which are not even demands, which he's making on our European partners, which, feeble as they are, cannot be met. And quite how he's going to finesse that, I don't know. But if you want to leave, then surely you have to have, this is, after all, a parliamentary country governed by the Queen and Parliament, you have to have a political party standing at a general election on a policy of leaving, winning a majority in the House of Commons. And the fact is that this country has had many years to turn its back on the Conservative Party, which has been the enthusiastic party of our humiliation in Europe since the 1960s. And many years to punish that party for leading us into this economic and political disaster and the rape of our laws, which to me is the worst, by far the worst part of it. All else shrinks into nothing beside the way in which our common law and our presumption of innocence and all the great things which our forebears won for us are being chucked away by this. But we've had all this time to reject the Conservative Party, those of us who care about the country, and year after year, election after election after election, this dreadful, dreadful organisation survives when it should be being flushed down the unitas.
Twyfords.
And if we haven't got the spirit to kick the Conservative Party down the plumbing, do we possess the spirit to be an independent country again? I don't know. It seems unlikely to me. I hope so, but nothing in what I see of the behaviour or attitude of the British people suggests that most of us care enough. Many of us fear independence. And I think that the fear of independence, the fear of being on our own, will be exploited endlessly by those who wish to keep us in during the referendum campaign. And I think that leaving aside all else, that fear will probably drive us to stay in. And that, I think, sums up the question. Are we still the people we were before? How many people can even remember being an independent country or what it was like? And how many care? I'd love to be wrong. I'd really love to be wrong, but I don't see any sign of it. So prove me wrong by all means, but that's really my answer to it. I wish it was so, but it may well not be.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think I promised you a lively and challenging evening with tonight's guest speaker, and I'm sure you agree with me that he hasn't let us down. Forthright in his opinions, very clear in what he has to say, and I think, possibly to the surprise of many, he has given us a lecture which has made us think back through at least 100 years of history, to think much more about what it is to be British and what it is to be European, etc., etc. For that alone, I'm deeply grateful, because it adds to our sum of knowledge as we contemplate these complicated issues. And I do appreciate the robustness with which he's conducted tonight's question time and left us with a great deal of food for thought. I just wish that we could discuss some of the other topics that we have in mind with Peter Hitchens, but perhaps, just perhaps, he might come back again at some future date. I, for one, hope so, and the rest of you, I hope you will show your appreciation of his visit right now. Thank you.
Thank you.